The idea is, yes, you take the story, you put it into your mind, and then you begin the important process of learning how to think, essentially.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Director of Marketing. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. Well, Andrew, September is winding down, which means it's time to turn the page to a new unit.
Yes.
So today we're going to talk about
Unit 3.
Which is?
Well, Retelling Narrative Stories, of course.
That's right. So lots of history behind this unit. You want to share briefly what some of the history is?
Well, yeah, it was interesting because Dr. Webster, before he was Dr. Webster, was Mr. Webster, teaching grade 5 in Vancouver. In those days, there were certain things that were very well set in terms of curriculum and what teachers should do. And one of those things was how to write science experiment write-ups.
Right.
So
I remember that.
You have one section of your paper is for the materials and your setup and your hypothesis, and then the next one is for your procedures, and then the end is the outcome of your experiment and your conclusions about that. And he noticed that all his kids did very well with that because there was this structure to the writing, and so nobody had the problem, I don't know what to write about. But there wasn't anything similar for story writing. It was kind of, even in those days, which would have been, the 50s, I guess, were pretty loose as they are today. It's a story, whatever you want to do. And many of the kids kind of floundered on that. So he was over visiting his aunt, Mrs. Anna Ingham, founder of the Blended Soundsite Program of Learning, for a Thanksgiving meal. And she had a little pile of student papers on her coffee table there. And these were grade 1 and 2 students. And so he picked them up and started reading through them. And he quickly realized that her little grade 1-2 kids were writing stories that were better than most of the stories that his grade 5 students were producing, which, of course, might cause a little consternation. So he said, Aunt Gertrude, how do you do this? How do you get these kids to write these good stories? She pulled out a little, in Canadian English, you'd say serviette.
A serviette.
Which would be a paper napkin in our vernacular. And she drew out for him the story sequence chart that she had been using with these kids. And it had basically these 3 parts, which was characters and setting, conflict and development, and then climax and resolution. She had not specified the number of paragraphs. It was just, here's all the questions you ask to get all of these things in your story, and it comes out better than if you don't have all these things in your story. And Webster looked at it, and he thought, well, there's 3 parts. That corresponds perfectly with the 3-part science experiment write-up that seems to be going quite well. And so he came back and instituted then that 3-paragraph model and found it to be hugely successful, a breakthrough for a lot of the kids. And then there's always, some who, well, I can't think of characters or I can't think of problem or whatever. And he said, well, just retell some story you know. You don't have to make up a new story. Just retell something, kind of the pragmatism of a male fifth grade teacher in Vancouver school. And what he found then was that then everyone in the class could find something and do it decently well, and that they were able to kind of play with and experiment and have fun. And so he developed that over the years. And then, of course, he went off to get his PhD in African history. He went off to work and teach in Africa for 16 years. And it wasn't until after he returned from Africa and started helping Mrs. Ingham teach the summer 11-day blended sound site program course in northern Alberta that he
11 days of teacher training.
11
in the middle
days,
of summer.
yes, in the summer, which I suppose could either be viewed as a vacation or a blessing, depending on your attitude about life.
Well, and here's just one more piece of that. The sun doesn't set for very long in that part of the world during the summer.
I've been there.
So those are long days.
You've been there. It is northern. I mean, we're talking 5 hours north of Edmonton, and we would take over the Alberta Vocational Center for 2 weeks and set up and do 6 days and then 5 days of teacher training. And that's where Webster really started to gather together all of the elements that he had developed, both in his years of teaching elementary and middle and high school, and also college and university, and put it all together in kind of a very huge and rough set of handouts. Was where I encountered him in 1990. But that Unit 3, to me, has always been a very interesting one, and it's one of the tougher ones for teachers and parents who are they're doing their first year through the syllabus.
That has been my experience as well. It's a little bit of a leap from Unit 2 to Unit 3. Why is that, and how can you help us?
Yeah, well, in Unit 2, it's 1 and 2 are so straightforward. Read a sentence, choose 3 key words, copy those 3 key words. Read the next sentence, choose 3 key words, copy those key words, do it till you've finished, put the original away, tell it back, write it out.
So easy.
It's very concrete. The hardest question you have to ask is, which 3 words should I choose? Mm-hmm. And if your source text is at or below the reading level, it shouldn't be too tough, and you can choose various ones and still have relatively certain success because the idea was pretty intact to start with. With Unit 3, we have shifted off this idea of pulling keywords from the source text. And that's the biggest shift, really. Rather than looking in the sentence or looking on the page for the keywords, instead, we take the source text, we read the whole thing. It's a story, it's a fable, it's a myth, it's a fairy tale, it's a poem, it's a movie, anything. As long as it has characters, problem, and resolution, you could use it as a source text for Unit 3. But the method is different. You take the source text, put it into your mind. So you read it again if you need to, talk about it, be sure you kind of get it, could tell it back if you needed to, get it into the mind. Then when you put the outline on the paper, you're not looking in the source text for the keywords, you're looking to yourself. You're looking to your own mind.
I love how you demonstrate this on video, where you take a piece of paper and roll it up, and it's almost like a magic trick. You put it into your brain. Of course, we know you're putting it behind, but that idea of putting it into your mind so that you're not looking at the source text, you're just looking into your mind. I think that's what's really important.
Well, it's a very stupid-looking magic trick, but the idea is to do something that helps reinforce the idea in the memory of teachers. One of our problems when we teach the TWSS live is we compress what was even overwhelming for me over 11 days. We compress it into 2 days and hope that everyone's going to remember all the most important parts.
Right.
And that's why when we, the live training, especially with schools, we always want them to have the video so that people can review those units as they work through the school year. So second year of school, moving into Unit 3, rewatch that part, and then you get to see my lousy magic trick. But the idea is, yes, you take the story, you put it into your mind, and then you begin the important process of learning how to think, essentially, which is the whole story, fiction, creative, inventive side of our syllabus, by asking the questions that help you pull the story out of your mind. And that's where Mrs. Ingham's story sequence chart, becomes that first tool for thinking about the story. So, some kids, they're really sharp. Some of them I know here. You just say, well, the first one is characters and setting. The second one is conflict or problem and the development. The third one is resolution and outcome. And that's what you do. And some kids would be like, okay, got it. But other kids would be like, but where do I start? Mm-hmm. So we break that down then in the poster that we recommend or provide for people so that we say, okay, what questions go with character? Well, who's in the story? And there could be one or more characters depending on the story. And what are some additional questions to help you add some detail? So who's in the story? What are they like? What's their situation? What's their circumstance? What's their personality? What's their character? Change that into a question. And then setting, we generally think of time and place, so the questions of where and when. Although usually there's some other little element in the story that wouldn't necessarily fall into the category of when or where, but is necessary for the story. So it's kind of part of what we might call the setup. Mm-hmm. So I think perhaps that term, the setup, would be a little better than setting, mm-hmm. in that it's a little more open-ended. So, the Fox and the Crow, part of that setup is the cheese.
Right.
With the Bat and the Nightingale, part of the setup is the mosquitoes. Mm-hmm. With the Lord of the Rings, part of the setup is the ring. So you look and say, what are all the elements that are kind of necessary to be present for this story to occur, in addition to the time and place? And that should give you enough. Those questions should give you enough to give that characters and setup at least a short paragraph, if not maybe a long paragraph, mm-hmm. to get going. Then the next one, of course, is what's the conflict or problem, and how does that unroll? Some people would say plot, but plot is kind of vague. I mean, if you look at it and say, well, what does that mean? Plot, it's what happens. Well, okay, as I have often said, you can have some people would just kind of write a story where the characters go here and do this, and then they go here and do that, and then they go here and do this, and they do that, and they do this and that, and then she gets tired and writes the end. So to enforce this idea, you have to have a conflict, a problem that needs to be solved. Mm-hmm. That helps then the student mm-hmm. either create or determine what that is. But again, you need a little help.
Right.
More questions.
More questions.
So what does one of the characters or more of the characters, what do they want or need? That usually helps to identify a problem or a need or a desire. And then the whole process is, how is that problem or need or desire solved or fulfilled? Mm-hmm. So we want to find the buried treasure. We want to climb the highest mountain. We want to escape the bad guys, that type of thing. And when you can identify that, then the rest of it flows pretty well. And the questions that follow are, okay, well, you got a problem. What's the first thing you have to do?
Solve the problem.
Solve the problem. You got to think of something, right? And that's really what the word plot means. If you look at it, it means to think or plan, right? If
right.
It's a verb.
It's true. Yep.
So how are the characters planning? Mm-hmm. And then how do they interact with each other? What do they say? What kind of conversation happens? What do they do to implement their problem? What do they do to implement their plan to solve their problem? And so all of those things can be a little mixed up too. I mean, sometimes you discover what they're thinking by what they say. Mm-hmm. Or sometimes it's just a conversation that solves the problem. And so if you just kind of recycle those till you have enough, what do they want or need? What do they think? What do they say? What do they do? What else do they think? What else do they say? What else do they do? And then, of course, longer stories can be a little more complex because they can have multiple problems. Mm-hmm. So, you have one big overarching huge problem, but then you've got other little problems, or what sometimes would be called subplots, or clues to discover, or you try something, it doesn't work, you try something else, it doesn't work, third time's a charm. That's kind of a fairy tale formula there. And so part of Unit 3 is helping the students to say, okay, if I've got a story that's long and I can't tell everything that happens along the way, then what's kind of the big overarching problem? And so that's why it can be kind of a form of helping them learn to limit or summarize.
Right. So I think of, for example, The Wizard of Oz. This is a very long story. It may be difficult for a young child to be able to summarize that in just 3 paragraphs. But an older child, that would be a good exercise.
It would be a challenge. I think it would best be done after a number of easier stories had been done.
Right.
That's why in our materials we generally start out with shorter stories that have only one basic problem that need to be solved. And then as they gain in experience, usually over a year or 2 or 3, then we can throw at them more complex stories and say, okay, you still only get 3 paragraphs, so what are you going to leave out? So that, and then helping them to identify the climax, the turning point, the beginning of the end. That I find is difficult for all of us.
Yep.
I'll do practicums with teachers or, a live TWSS, and oftentimes that's, well, where does this climax hit exactly? Sometimes it's kind of obvious. Sometimes it isn't. But what I've discovered over the years is that if you just get it all in there somewhere, you don't have to be terribly precise about which event falls where in the story. Maybe it falls at the very end of the 2nd paragraph or the beginning of the 3rd. It all comes out in the wash. But that idea of what changes the circumstance so that the want or need is either fulfilled, as in a happy ending, or ceases to exist, as in some stories where the main characters die, so they no longer have the want or need to be together.
A tragedy.
A tragedy. So that story sequence chart is so effective. And, I will admit, when people see it, sometimes they think, well, that's awfully simplistic. I kind of thought that when I first saw it, and I thought, well, yeah, this is great for little kids. But the truth is, even the great epic stories, they do follow this sequence. They have these elements, and that the best way to help children learn to write better stories on their own is to have them practice kind of imitating, retelling existing stories. And there's a process whereby we can start with that dictated story as it is, kind of like a summary, and then move toward the more original creation.
So speak to that a little bit. How can students who have had some experience with the Unit 3 model expand their thinking?
Well, one of my favorite things to do right off is just give them the freedom to elaborate a little bit. So, I think retelling a story exactly as it is, it's okay. And in some cases, that may be the task.
Right.
If someone says, summarize this story, i.e., don't change anything, just leave some of it out. That's what they're saying. Okay, we could do that, but it's kind of boring. So I like to, play with it and give them little ideas of how they might, change small elements of the story just to customize it a little bit. And one of the great thing about using Aesop fables, other fables, fairy tales, folk tales of different countries, parables, myths, is that these aren't owned by anyone. They've been around for hundreds of thousands of years. People have been retelling them in different ways for centuries or millennia, so it's freeing. You can go and retell one of these old stories, and nobody's going to say, oh, you plagiarized.
Right.
Oh, you stole it. Oh, you didn't do something original enough. Because, well, let's face it, name some of the great people who've been retelling other people's stories. Well, Shakespeare would be an obvious one. Nathaniel Hawthorne, C.S. Lewis, the whole Disney Corporation.
I was just going to say, yes.
So there's no crime in that. And so that's why working with those types of stories, and those stories generally have themes that we can all relate to. They work with themes like, greed, as in Midas, or themes as blessed are the innocent, as in Cinderella, or be careful what you do, as in many Aesop fables. And so these themes children relate to, they're meaningful, they apply, they're timeless tales, and they can play with them. So that idea of elaborate is where I like to start. Everyone feel free to just play with this thing. Now, sometimes you get boys who play with it kind of to an extreme. So, you've got the hare and the tortoise, and instead of the hare deciding to take a nap, he has to go over to his friend's house and play Call of Duty, which he gets sucked into for the next 5 hours because it's such a great game. And meanwhile, the tortoise is plodding along because, Okay, well, is there anything wrong with that? I mean, it's obviously Aesop didn't come up with the thing, but that is the normal possible application in a young boy's mind of that situation.
Sure.
Okay, so there's that first step of elaboration. Then the next step of change it up a little bit. Keep the plot, keep the problem, but change the characters and setting. So you can move a story from its original setting into some different time and place. And that's very exciting because, of course, as most of our listeners know, one of the things that we really like to do is encourage people not to make writing a separate subject, in isolation, but a part of learning about everything else. So you have a story, and you may be able to transport that story into a setting of an historical time period that you're reading and talking about.
So like historical fiction.
Sure, exactly. And, of course, a lot of very successful authors have essentially done that.
Yes.
But let's say you have a story like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, and you're studying the American Revolutionary War time period. Well, you could write that story, and instead of a boy, you could have a colonial sentry. Instead of a wolf, you have a British, attack, and so you've got the sentry who cried British attack, and the whole story would unfold very similarly, but you'd be using your knowledge of that time period. Or you could move it to ancient Egypt or medieval period or modern day circumstances. Some of the most interesting and best stories I've ever got from kids were parables like The Prodigal Son set in a modern day situation, and really well done and thoughtful. And yeah, you could see the parallel, but isn't that great? Because that's the kids exercising their moral imagination. So there's the lesson to be learned. Now, what characters and setting would allow that lesson to be learned by today's modern young person?
Right. So you mentioned historical fiction. Could you also actually write about events of history using the story sequence chart?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A lot of history is conflict and resolution. In fact, almost all of history that's worth talking about is conflict resolution.
Right.
So you have a problem and you have a discovery, such as flight or penicillin. That could be written in a 3-paragraph story sequence model. Or you have the start of a war, or you have a particular battle within a war, or you have the problem of how do we win the space race. I mean, the possibilities are really limitless. One of the places where teachers and parents get a little uneasy is, well, what if you tell the story of, the Wright brothers, Neil Armstrong on the moon, and you make up a bunch of stuff that you don't have any historical support for?
Right.
And that's a tough one because, in a way, a lot of people have written stuff for which there's not all that much historical support. But on the other hand, we feel uncomfortable because it sounds like we're reporting facts. So I think as long as we try to make it clear to the kids, and that's why changing the characters is so helpful, certainly I can imagine all sorts of historical events that would fall into a 3-paragraph format. And that analysis, what were the circumstances, what was the problem, and how was it resolved? Had a student do a really good job with a little summary of Joan of Arc, going to talk to the Dauphin and tell him you need to be crowned king and this is how we're going to take back the city and do it. And, lots of people have written semi-fictional accounts of Joan of Arc because no one was actually there.
Right. Exactly. Okay, so I just want to, just a couple questions, kind of at both ends of the spectrum. We spoke a little bit of how you could adapt Unit 3, for example, for high school. What about primary students, kindergartners who may not be writing? What kind of things could you do with Unit 3?
Yeah, well, that story sequence chart is just a great tool to have on the wall in your teaching environment, whether it's at home or in a classroom. Gosh, I've been reading Ping, the story of Ping, because I have a 4-year-old grandson who, for some reason, is happy to listen to me read Ping 3 times in a row on the same day every time I see him.
Yes.
Well, okay, so you could have a conversation with a 4-year-old. Who's in the story? Ping. Who else? Well, his aunts and uncles and brothers and cousins. Where are they? Well, they go into this boat and they float around on the beautiful Yangtze River.
Read that once or twice myself.
And I have never figured out why yellow water would be particularly beautiful, but nevertheless, so what's the problem? Well, Ping doesn't want to get a spank. Okay, and so you could actually just use that story sequence chart. If it's on the wall, boom, you can actually point to it and refer to it. And if you've got it in your mind, you just work through it. Take any story you read with young children, ask those questions, and you're helping them develop their analytical ability to look at something a little more objectively. You're encouraging their narration to be able to tell back, things that happened in the story in a structured, sequential way. I mean, narrative means it goes through time, so there's that. And you can even use the last part of the chart. Well, what do they learn? What's the lesson? What's the what's the point of the story? Sometimes those questions can help kids think a little more deeply too. Oh, so what does Ping learn? Well, it's better to get your spank and stay with your family than to be stranded and almost lose your life.
Yes.
Or whatever they come up with,
Right.
Probably not. My 4-year-old grandson who's not going to come up with that kind of statement.
Right.
He might just look at me and go, I don't know, Grandpa, what? But that's okay too.
Right. Right. You can have conversations. So I'm thinking as we're having this podcast about Unit 3, these podcasts are replacing our monthly webinars.
Right.
But I do want to be sure we link in our show notes to the monthly webinar that we did last year on Unit 3 because we had more time to talk about it then.
Sure.
But can you just briefly touch on the stylistic techniques and why Unit 3 may be a good time to introduce some new ones?
Sure. Well, one of the things people notice right off about stylistic techniques is, as soon as you give kids a list of ly adverbs to choose and put one in each paragraph of a composition, there's an appropriateness challenge there. If you're working in the world of nonfiction and fact, you can't just grab any word and stick it in. It might change the fact. It might change the underlying nature of the statement that you're making, and that makes people feel uncomfortable, which is why, in general, it's easier to introduce new style techniques when you're on the kind of the fiction, narrative, inventive side of things. So in Unit 2, when you're working with Aesop fables, it's easy, There's lots of options for ly word or connecting up ideas with a which clause or a strong verb. Same thing with Unit 3. Because it's this inventive process, it's okay to elaborate. It's okay to put one in, and you're not having to be obedient to the facts. It's harder in Unit 4. So as you introduce the stylistic techniques, hopefully everyone understands fully the EZ+1 rule. And So if the 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever you've taught so far in Unit 1 and 2 appear to be easy for your students, or most of them, then you can introduce the next style technique. Maybe you moved into strong verb, or maybe you're with older kids, you're moving into quality adjective, and now it's relatively safe, I guess, would be the thing. Here's a bunch of options. Use one. It's not going to rip up or change or frustrate the reader with a change in factual information. Whereas Unit 4, that's going to be a little bit tougher.
Right.
Because you have to be now obedient to the facts, which I assume we'll talk about next month.
We will. We'll talk about Unit 4 next month. As we wrap up, I do want to mention to our listeners just a couple of resources that we have. One is, I've mentioned already, the webinars. So please do click on look at the show notes and find the link to our webinar. Also, look into the resource A Word Right Now, because that has LY adverbs, quality adjectives, strong verbs, all organized according to character qualities.
It is the ultimate perfect kids thesaurus, really. And you can get the whole book on an app, too.
That's right.
If you prefer.
So we'll also put a link to our mobile app. We have 2 versions. One is a free version. One is a paid one. The paid one is based on the book A Word Right Now, so that's very handy. And then the third thing I want to mention is our magnum opus e-newsletter. We'll put a link in the show notes for that. Every month during the school year, we send out a e-newsletter. This is different than our print or our EPUB magazine, but the newsletter focuses on the unit of the month. And of course, this month's unit is Unit 3, Retelling Narrative Stories. So, Andrew, it's a pleasure to pick your brain, and I'm sure our listeners also appreciate your insight into Unit 3. Thank you.
It's always good to do it.
Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcasts. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudewa and the team at IEW, I thank you for the privilege of allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.